Hello, welcome to week 2 of Office Hours. This is still my office. Most of it is still a mess, so I'm still not eager to show you much of it. Unfortunately, I'm having to show you more of it this week because I made the mistake last week of not taping in the format that the Coursera platform demands, the widescreen format. So now I am doing that, and you can see more of my office. For example, my dog Fraser sleeping over there on the chair, possibly wondering why I'm doing what I'm doing here, talking to something other than a person or a dog, which are the things he normally sees me talk to. Okay, so this week, the award for most creative metaphor related to a meditation retreat goes to Wynn Matthews. In the discussion forum, he said, "In retreats, at times of broad stillness, I've experienced the feeling of being squeezed like a toothpaste tube." What does he mean? I'm going to hold you in suspense for a second and go over to the Facebook page where Carl Mountain said something that's related to what Wynn Matthews said. Carl Mountain says, having seen me say in one of the lectures that our feelings are not necessarily to be trusted, he says, I would suggest, as many Buddhist teachers have already, that it is not just feelings that can't be trusted, but moreover, you can't trust your thoughts as being true. That is certainly the case. But there is a connection between those two issues, the untrustworthiness of feelings and of thoughts, and that brings us back to the tube of toothpaste. What Wynn Matthews went on to say about this feeling of being squeezed like a tube of toothpaste was, there's a very subtle pressure, tension, constriction, and out of that comes a thought stream, a reaction to the feeling tone. So in other words, he was sensing when he reflected on his interior life, as you are inclined to do on a meditation retreat, that feelings were governing thoughts, that feelings were eliciting thoughts. He says earlier, every sensory input comes with a feeling tone, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and reactions to those feeling tones cause certain thought streams. I think it's right. I think thoughts certainly can elicit feelings, but feelings can elicit thoughts, and I think they do so more subtly than we often realize. And you become aware of these kinds of subtle things through the meditation practice, and I think a retreat is a particularly good place to become aware of them. Now, as for the virtues of this degree of attentiveness to your interior life and a kind of a mindful perspective, Wynn goes on to say the following. This was in response to a post in the discussion forum by Camilla Balkan, who had raised the question of the distinction between feelings and emotions. And here's what Wynn Matthews went on to say in the course of his reply. When my wife says something that I don't like, and a strong feeling of dislike arises in the body, and Wynn, by the way, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've been there. He goes on to say that being aware of the feeling of dislike, rather than being, kind of reflexively captive to it, changes his reaction. He says, it may take a minute for it to pass, but I'm able to respond to what she's said rather than react. And I know exactly that feeling too. I remember after my first meditation retreat, in the days after my first meditation retreat, I remember like my kids would do something that would make me feel like yelling at them, and I would get the feeling to yell at them, the feeling that normally preceded yelling at them, but it's like I would observe it and not act on it. And it was amazing, and it's something that's easier for me to do right after a meditation retreat, but at any time, if the more I'm practicing the meditation, the easier that kind of thing is. So like right now, I'm doing 30, 40 minutes of meditation every morning. It hasn't transformed me into a wonderful person, But my wife says it makes me a better person, and she should know. Um, so, speaking of which, uh, Cameron Kingsbury, this was in the discussion forum, says, I have noticed an emphasis on separating the self from an emotion. Instead of saying, I am angry, one can say, I am experiencing anger. And that gets at the distinction, yes, between kind of owning the feeling and letting the feeling own you on the one hand, and seeing the feeling as somewhere in your realm of consciousness, but not being captivated by it. That said, I do think it's a lot harder than just saying this, right? I mean, just saying, you can't. I mean, if you just say, well, from now on, whenever I'm angry, I'll just, instead of saying I am angry, I'll say I am experiencing anger. Well, no, probably, by the time I'm just saying, without the meditation practice, it's going to be hard for little reminders like that to really take root, at least in my experience. Another feeling related question. This one came in via Twitter. And again, probably the surest way to get make sure I at least see a question is to address it to @DarwinDharma on Twitter. I mean, I'm doing my best to keep up with everything on discussion forum, Facebook, Twitter, and my two assistants are as well. But I sometimes miss things because they go by so quickly on the forum and sometimes on Facebook. Whereas Twitter, for one thing, the traffic is just slower, I guess. Well, anyway, back to Melissa, whose Twitter handle is MindXGeek. She says, if unpleasant emotions are linked to avoidance and pleasant ones to approach, how to explain rage and anger? Now, this gets at something I said when I quoted a 19th century biologist saying that what feelings seem to be about is, pleasant feelings get the organism to approach things that are good for it, like food. Unpleasant feelings like fear get it to escape from things like predators or leave the vicinity of things like toxins. And Melissa is asking, well, what about rage and anger? The which kind of feel bad. I guess she's saying they kind of feel bad, but you don't run away from the person, right? You like accost the person, approach the person in anger. Well, first of all, I'd say that quote from the biologist, that was kind of in the first instance, when feelings arose in evolution. This seems to be the kind of primordial function. Positive and negative, pleasant, unpleasant feelings, approach, avoidance. Once you get to being as complicated as humans, it's complicated. So, for example, I might have pleasant feelings about one person, unpleasant feelings towards another. What that leads me to do in some cases is not either approach or avoid either one. It leads me to say good things about the first person and bad things about the other. And there are a lot of, more complicated the animal, the more complicated things have gotten as evolution has, made use of these feelings in kind of increasingly, you might say, convoluted ways. That said, I would also suggest to Melissa that if she pays close attention to rage and anger, she may feel like that, she may see that in some ways, there's something pleasant is maybe a misleading word, but when you're angry, it feels good. Something, to yell, and also when you are angry and enraged, you feel you're right and they're wrong, and that's a good feeling, right? It may not be a true feeling, that's the point. And this gets back to the relationship between feelings and thoughts. This feeling, which is not to be trusted, will sponsor a thought, which is not to be trusted, which is that you're always right, and the other people are wrong. How's Fraser doing? Yeah, I see he's not really inspired by my little discourse here. Fraser's the least. I have two dogs. Fraser is the least Buddhist dog in the house, the less Buddhist of the two. But maybe I'll save that for another day. Okay, so one last thing on that. I think if I've got this quote right, the Buddha is said to have said that anger is the unless he was talking about hatred, but I think it was anger. Uh, the poisoned root with the honeyed tip, suggesting that that he too thought there was something uh, actually pleasant about anger, and seductively pleasant. Um, and in any event, it is certainly true that all of these subtleties of feeling and their connection to thought and so on, awareness of that is something that in principle mindfulness can foster, and in principle you can carry that into your everyday life, um, and be less vulnerable to the misleading drift, and the untruthful drift sometimes of both feelings and thoughts. Now, I'm going to stop here because for various reasons, and then talk about some other stuff.